The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the mountain range, battering against the fragile cabin walls. The once pristine snow, now a ghostly blanket, curled and twisted under the fury of the storm. Inside, Gar sat hunched over a small, flickering fire, his rough hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea. The flames cast a soft orange glow on the wooden beams of the cabin, but Gar barely noticed. His mind wandered, like the snowdrifts outside, unpredictable and lost in a storm of its own. It had been years since he'd made this place his home, this cabin tucked away in the frozen expanse of the mountains. Years since the world had seemed anything more than a place of hurt and memories. He hadn't always lived alone. In fact, he had once been a man of the village, a part of a community. That was before the fire, before everything was stripped from him, leaving him here, alone in the wilderness where no one could find him and no one cared enough to try. Gar took a sip of the bitter tea, its warmth providing fleeting comfort. His reflection in the window opposite him was barely visible through the thick frost, a mere shadow of the man he had once been. His once dark hair was now streaked with gray, his face etched with deep lines that spoke of grief, hardship, and regret. But there was no time for self-pity in these mountains. There was only survival, and in the solitude Gar had learned how to survive. The snow had taught him its own harsh lessons, and the mountains had demanded respect. Yet, no matter how much he adapted to this frigid, lonely existence, the weight of his past remained. His wife, Leah, had been everything to him. They had planned a future together, a life in the village with children and love. But one night, a wildfire had swept through the region, destroying everything in its path. The fire had stolen her away from him, leaving only ashes and shattered dreams in its wake. And Gar, consumed with guilt and grief, had fled to the mountains where no one could remind him of what he had lost. As the years passed, he had become a ghost in the world, hidden from the village below, hidden from the world that had once known his name. His only companions were the howling winds, the cold, and the occasional animals that passed through the wilderness. Gar didn't mind the solitude. It had become his way of life, but sometimes, just sometimes, a part of him longed for the warmth of human connection, the laughter that used to fill his home. That was the cruel irony of isolation. It could numb the pain, but it also amplified the emptiness inside. The storm outside was worsening, the snow now falling in thick, dense sheets that obliterated the view beyond the cabin. Gar stood from his chair, stretching his stiff limbs before moving toward the window. The glass was frosted over, but he could still make out the shapes of the trees swaying in the gusts. It was in moments like this that the mountains felt even more alien to him. The storm seemed to carry with it the ghosts of his past, whispering through the cracks in the cabin walls, mocking his loneliness. As he stared out into the blizzard, something caught his eye, a shadow, a flicker of movement in the swirling snow. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But then, it happened again. A dark figure, moving with purpose, struggling against the storm. His heart raced, adrenaline surging through him as he rushed to the door, throwing it open against the gale. The cold hit him like a slap, the biting wind cutting through his jacket and sending a shiver through his bones. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes straining to see what had caught his attention. At first, there was nothing, just the snow, endless and white, swirling in chaotic gusts. But then, from the shadows, a form emerged, a small creature, hunched low to the ground, moving slowly through the snow. Gar's breath caught in his throat. It was a wild animal, struggling to survive in the storm. A wolf, perhaps? He stepped forward, instinctively moving toward the creature. But as he got closer, the shape became clearer, and his heart stopped. It wasn't a wolf. It was something far rarer. 2 snow leopards, injured, barely able to move, their coats matted with ice, their eyes wide with fear. For a moment, Gar froze, torn between caution and compassion. Snow leopards were not meant for this kind of survival. They were creatures of the high mountains, solitary, elusive, and yet here they were, broken and helpless in the face of a storm. The storm was relentless, and Gar knew that these creatures had no chance in the wild, not in this weather. His survival instincts screamed at him to leave them be, to shut the door and forget what he had seen. But something else stirred in him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, compassion. He looked at the leopards, their breaths shallow, their fur heavy with snow, their eyes pleading with him in a way he couldn't ignore. With a heavy sigh, Gar moved closer to them, kneeling in the snow. He reached out a hand, hesitating for a moment before brushing the snow from their fur. His hands shook, but he didn't pull away. "I can't leave you here," he whispered, more to himself than to them. Slowly, Gar lifted the smaller of the 2 leopards into his arms, careful not to hurt it further. The larger one seemed to sense his intentions and allowed Gar to help. though it growled low in its throat. Gaur ignored the warning. He had no time for fear. He carried them both inside, the storm howling louder than ever, as though trying to pull him back into the wilderness. But Gaur was already past the point of no return. He shut the door behind him, closing out the cold, and placed the leopards gently near the fire. The crackling flames cast a warm light over the creatures, their eyes reflecting the firelight as they settled into the heat. Gaur sat down on the floor beside them, still unsure of what had led him to make this choice. But he knew one thing for certain: the storm had brought them to him, and now they were his responsibility. He could not, and would not, turn away. As the night wore on, Gaur watched over the leopards, tending to their wounds and offering what little comfort he could. But the strange feeling inside him, the one that had flickered to life when he first saw them, had only grown stronger. He wasn't just a man trying to survive anymore. He was a man given a purpose. He had been shown, in the most unlikely of circumstances, that he still had something to offer the world. And so, as the storm raged on outside, Gaur made a silent vow to these creatures, to the wilderness that had been his home for so long. He would protect them. He would see them through this. And in doing so, perhaps he could heal too. The snow leopards might have been the ones in need of saving tonight, but Gaur knew in his heart that, in some way, they would be the ones to save him. The storm raged for hours. Gaur could hear the wind tearing at the cabin's exterior, pushing against the walls like a relentless beast trying to break in. The leopards, now inside and settled near the fire, were beginning to show signs of recovery. Their breathing was less labored, and the stillness of the cabin allowed Gaur to study them more closely. They were magnificent creatures. Their coats, though matted with snow and dirt, retained an ethereal beauty. The snow leopard's fur was a thick, creamy blend of grays and whites, with dark rosettes scattered like shadows across their coats. Gaur had heard of them in stories, in whispers among the villagers who spoke of the creature's elusive nature, but to see them up close was something entirely different. It was as though they belonged to a world he could never truly understand. The smaller of the two leopards, a female, seemed to be in worse shape. Her right hind leg was bent at an odd angle, clearly broken, and her body shivered from the cold that had seeped into her bones. The other leopard, a male, had a deep gash along his flank, which Gaur had begun to clean, though the animal's growls made it clear that he was not pleased with the attention. Gaur sighed and sat back against the wall, his body aching from the effort of bringing them inside. It had been a while since he had used muscles in such a way, and the exhaustion was beginning to set in. The fire crackled before him, its warmth battling the chill that still clung to the cabin's wooden frame. He looked at the leopards again. They were both staring at him, their amber eyes reflecting the firelight full of mistrust and uncertainty. "I'm not going to hurt you," he muttered, rubbing his face with his hand. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm not going to hurt you." The words felt strange in his mouth. In the isolation of the mountains, he hadn't spoken much to anyone, or anything, in years. The silence had become a blanket for him, something he wrapped around himself like the snow that now blanketed the world outside. But these creatures, these wild beings, had pierced that silence. They had forced him to speak. His thoughts were interrupted by a low growl from the male leopard. Gaur turned his head toward the creature, whose body was tense, muscles coiled beneath its thick fur. The leopard's eyes never left Gaur, a silent warning in their depths. Gaur nodded slowly. "I won't get any closer for now, but I'm here to help." The female leopard shifted slightly, her injury causing her to wince. The sharpness of the growl from the male died down as he noticed the discomfort in her movement. Gaur stood up and moved closer to the fire, keeping his eyes on the leopards. He knew better than to make sudden movements. His every instinct told him to be cautious, to retreat into the familiar solitude that had defined his life for so long. But then, something in him stopped him from turning away. The leopards weren't just wild animals, they were survivors like him. And in this storm, they were all in this together. They had been drawn here for some reason, by some force neither of them could explain. It was as though the storm itself had conspired to bring them together, to force him out of his solitude and into the chaos of caring for something more than himself. Gaur set about preparing a space for the leopards by the fire, making sure they had enough room to rest comfortably. He moved slowly, cautiously, but with purpose. He knew he had to act quickly if he wanted them to survive. The storm outside wasn't showing any signs of letting up, and the leopards needed shelter and food. Gaur had no idea if he even had enough supplies to take care of them, but he knew he couldn't leave them out in the cold. The male leopard gave a quiet snarl when Gaur approached again, this time with a bowl of water. But as Gaur set it down just beyond the reach of the firelight, the leopard's eyes softened slightly. The growl ceased, replaced by a slow, cautious sniff. The air between them seemed to shift, and for the first time, Gar felt a sense of understanding. They weren't just animals, they were fighters, like him. As the leopard took a tentative step forward to drink, Gar let out a slow breath. He hadn't realized how tightly he had been holding himself, but now that the tension was beginning to ease, he felt a strange calm wash over him. He leaned against the wall again, watching as both leopards lapped up the water. Gar knew it wasn't enough. He needed to tend to their wounds and make sure they were properly nourished, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. These creatures, these wild animals, were depending on him. They had no one else to turn to, and somehow he had become their protector in the midst of this blizzard, whether he was ready for it or not. The snowstorm outside continued its fierce assault, but inside the cabin, there was a tentative peace. Gar allowed himself to relax just a little, knowing he could not afford to be consumed by his past in this moment. The storm, the leopards, the fire, it was all part of the present now. There was nothing to go back to except the ghosts of memories that clung to him like the bitter cold of the mountains. He glanced at the leopards again. Their bodies were still tense, but there was something in their eyes that made Gar feel connected to them, if only for a brief moment. A spark of understanding, of shared survival, passed between them. And in that fleeting connection, Gar realized that the wildness of the mountains, the danger of the storm, wasn't just a threat. It was a shared experience. It was something he understood. But as the storm howled outside, Gar knew there was much more to this encounter than just sheltering these creatures. There was something deeper at work. The storm had brought them here, and in doing so, had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he had come to know about himself, his solitude, and the mountains he had once thought he understood. And as the leopards settled in, their eyes finally closing in exhaustion, Gar couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more significant than either of them could have imagined. The storm outside showed no sign of abating, its fury unchecked as the night wore on. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick with the scent of burning wood, the crackling fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The leopards, though exhausted, had settled beside it, their breathing becoming steady. Gar couldn't help but watch them, feeling an odd sense of responsibility for their survival. He was no stranger to loneliness, but tonight, in the presence of these creatures, he felt something stirring inside him, a connection he hadn't felt in years. The leopards, despite their wildness, seemed to recognize him as something more than a mere human. They were animals of instinct, yet in their eyes, Gar saw something akin to trust, however tentative it was. They knew on some primal level that they were safe, for now. Gar stood up and moved toward the small cupboard at the far end of the room. His hands moved automatically as he rummaged through the shelves, pulling out dried meat and some of the limited fresh provisions he had left. His mind was focused on one thing, getting them strong again. His own survival had never felt like much of a priority. He had long since learned to accept his solitude, but this was different. These creatures were depending on him. In that sense, he wasn't alone anymore. As he prepared a small meal, Gar glanced back at the leopards. The male had shifted slightly, his eyes still half-lidded, but watching Gar with a steady gaze. He had become more alert over the hours, as though the promise of food and safety was enough to keep his instincts sharp. The female was still resting, but her wounds would need attention before the storm ended. Gar could only guess how long they had been out there, in the snow, suffering and searching for shelter. Not all battles are won with force, Gar muttered to himself as he cut the dried meat into smaller pieces. The words echoed a thought that had been gnawing at him since the storm began. The mountains were unforgiving, the wilderness harsh and relentless. And yet, somehow, these two creatures had found their way to him, as though they were meant to be here. Gar couldn't help but wonder if the storm had brought them for a reason. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting the room in a dim orange glow. The howling wind outside still seemed to be pressing against the cabin, as though trying to force its way inside. Gar tried to ignore the eerie feeling that crept up his spine. It wasn't just the storm that felt unsettling, it was the awareness that something was lurking beyond his door, something he couldn't see but could feel in his bones. The thought was irrational, he knew. There was nothing out there but snow and wind, and yet the feeling wouldn't leave him. The longer he stayed in the cabin, the more he became convinced that the mountains were not as silent as they seemed. They were alive with the echoes of something ancient and untamed, and Gar was just a small part of it. He set the food down by the fire, his gaze shifting once more to the leopards. The male had taken a tentative step forward, sniffing the air, his nostrils flaring. The female's eyes were still closed, but her ears twitched at the scent of the food. Gar hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. He didn't want to force the creatures to eat, not yet. But they needed nourishment, and so, slowly, he moved closer, placing the small pieces of meat within reach. The male leopard regarded him for a long moment, its amber eyes calculating. Then, with a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the cabin, the leopard stepped forward and sniffed the food. Goer's heart skipped a beat. This was a moment of reckoning. Either the animal would accept the offer, or it would refuse, and Goer would have to find another way to earn its trust. The leopard took a tentative bite. Relief washed over Goer as he watched the male eat. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The leopards were beginning to trust him, and that was something Goer hadn't expected. The relationship between humans and wild animals was complex, fraught with misunderstanding and fear. But in this moment, the leopard seemed to understand that Goer wasn't a threat. He was a source of something more valuable, survival. The female leopard stirred, her ears flicking at the sound of the male eating. Slowly she opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the food. She didn't move immediately, but Goer could see the subtle change in her expression. There was no longer fear in her eyes, only the flicker of curiosity. "Go ahead," Goer murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need it." To his surprise, the female reached for the food, her movements slow and cautious, but determined. Goer watched as she ate, both leopards savoring the warmth and sustenance. For a moment, the cabin felt peaceful, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft chewing of the animals. But just as Goer began to allow himself a breath of relief, the wind outside picked up again, howling with renewed fury. The cabin groaned under the pressure, the walls creaking as the storm seemed to rage even harder than before. Goer turned his head toward the window, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the snow-laden glass. Something wasn't right. He couldn't explain it, but the unease that had settled in his chest deepened. There was something out there, beyond the swirling white, something more than just the storm. His instincts told him to stay inside, to remain hidden away, but another part of him, a darker, deeper part, urged him to take action. Goer stood up, his muscles tense as he made his way toward the door. The leopards, sensing his agitation, stopped eating and looked up at him. The male leopard growled softly, his body tense, ready for something he could not yet see. The wind howled louder, and the snow outside seemed to shift unnaturally, swirling in ways that didn't feel normal. Goer hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the old brass handle. He knew the wilderness was unpredictable, dangerous even, but this feeling, it was different. It wasn't just the storm, it was as though something else, something more dangerous, was out there in the dark, watching. He pushed the door open just a crack, peering into the swirling white darkness. There was nothing at first, just the endless snow and the howl of the wind. But then from the corner of his eye, he saw something, a shadow, shifting against the storm, something or someone moving just beyond the tree line. Goer's pulse quickened, and the growl of the male leopard beside him seemed to confirm his suspicions. Something was out there, something that was not just a part of the storm. And Goer knew without a doubt that the danger wasn't just in the snow. It was already here, creeping closer, and it had been drawn to the cabin. Goer's fingers tightened around the doorframe as his gaze locked onto the shifting shadow in the snow. It moved slowly, methodically, like a predator on the hunt, but there was something unsettlingly deliberate about its pace. The wind seemed to quiet, as if holding its breath, but the snow continued to whip against the cabin's walls. The leopards' growls grew louder, their fur bristling in unison. Goer could feel the weight of their presence beside him, two wild creatures, bound by instinct, now sharing his sense of unease. For a moment he wondered if they had detected something he couldn't see. Maybe they knew something he didn't, and he was merely too human to understand the deeper, more primal signals of the wilderness. With his heart hammering in his chest, Goer stepped back from the door, careful not to make a sound. He shut it slowly, the sound of the latch clicking in place feeling far too loud in the stillness that followed. The leopards, sensing the shift in his energy, stopped growling but remained alert, their golden eyes never leaving the door. What was out there? Goer couldn't answer that. He had spent years in these mountains, isolated from the world below, but never before had he felt this kind of foreboding presence. He'd faced blizzards, avalanches, and wild animals, but this was something else. This wasn't nature's fury. It was something far more deliberate, something that knew exactly what it was doing. He turned toward the fire, desperate for some sense of normalcy, something to ground him in reality. The flames danced and crackled, their orange glow casting shadows against the wooden walls. Goer breathed in the familiar scent of burning wood, but it did little to quell the tightening in his chest. He glanced at the leopards. They were watching him now, their gazes calm but calculating. The male was still standing, his body tense, his head angled toward the door as though waiting for something to happen. The female was curled up, but her eyes were wide open, alert. "Don't worry," Gore muttered under his breath, though he knew his words wouldn't comfort them. "It's just the storm." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The storm had brought them here, yes, but it felt as if it had brought something else with it, something darker, more dangerous. Gore didn't know if he was imagining things, if the isolation had finally begun to affect his mind, but the thought gnawed at him. And so, as much as he wanted to ignore it, his instincts were screaming at him to be ready. The snow outside was relentless, turning the world into an endless white blur. The howling wind continued its shrill scream, now sounding more like a voice that seemed to echo through the trees, over the mountains, as though beckoning him into the unknown. But Gar knew better than to venture out in the middle of a storm, even if it felt like the world was closing in on him. For the next several hours, Gar remained vigilant, staying as close to the leopards as he could. He fed them what little he had left, ensuring they had enough to regain their strength. The male had become more active, his tail flicking restlessly, as though unable to settle in one place for long. The female was still weak, but was slowly gaining back some of her strength. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of the leopards as they shifted. Gar found himself losing track of time, the isolation and the tension pulling him into a state of eerie stillness. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, as the wind seemed to subside just a little, Gar let himself sit down. He had been pacing for hours, running his mind over every possible scenario. Could it be poachers, some wandering lost soul who had gotten caught in the storm? Or was it something else entirely, something darker like a pack of wolves or wild hunters? But no answer seemed to make sense. His thoughts swirled, but nothing could explain the presence he'd felt. The shadow outside the cabin, its careful, deliberate movements, something about it felt far too calculated, too intelligent. The door rattled suddenly. Gar froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The leopards reacted instantly, both growling low, their muscles tense. Gar's breath caught in his chest as he stared at the door, unable to move, unable to make a sound. The wind howled again, but the rattle of the door continued, persistent, as if someone or something was trying to get in. Gar glanced toward the small window near the door, but the snow outside was so thick he could see nothing beyond a blur of white. "Who's there?" Gar demanded, his voice hoarse and filled with the tension he had been holding back. But no response came, only the continued rattling. The male leopard's growl deepened, and he stalked toward the door, his movements fluid but cautious. The female leopard remained in her spot, her eyes fixed on the door, her body low to the ground. Gar could feel their unease, the way they seemed to understand that this wasn't just the wind. Something was wrong. Without thinking, Gar moved toward the door. His hands shook as he reached for the handle, but before he could open it, the rattling ceased. A thick silence followed. Gar stood motionless, his breath coming in short gasps as he strained to listen. Was it gone? Had whatever it was finally moved on? He wasn't sure. The absence of sound was almost worse than the noise. His instincts screamed at him to stay away from the door, to remain hidden, to wait for the storm to pass. But the cabin felt suffocating now, too small, as though the walls were closing in around him. Another sound, faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A knock. It was soft, almost tentative, and yet it cut through the silence like a knife. Gar's heart thudded in his chest. His thoughts raced. His pulse quickened. Was it really someone, or something, out there? The knock came again, this time louder, more deliberate. Gar took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the hilt of the small knife he kept on a shelf near the door. The leopard's growls had stopped, replaced by a tense silence. He didn't want to open the door. He couldn't afford to be reckless. But there was no turning back now. Whatever was out there, it had come for a reason, and Gar had a feeling that this night, the storm, the leopards, the strange knocking, was only the beginning of something far bigger, far more dangerous than he could comprehend. But for now, he was alone with his thoughts and the creeping uncertainty that had taken root in his heart. There was no escaping it. The storm had come, and with it, the shadows, and they weren't leaving anytime soon. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, the silence pressing down on Gar like a heavy weight. His hand hovered over the door handle, the cold metal biting into his palm. The leopards, sensing his uncertainty, remained perfectly still, watching him with eyes that seemed to see more than he could. Their instincts were far sharper than his, and yet Gar couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for them. He'd made a choice when he decided to take them in, and now, it was a choice that could cost him more than just his peace. The knock came again, louder this time. There was no mistaking it. Whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't going to leave until they were acknowledged. Gar took a slow breath, steadying his nerves. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stay inside, to lock the door and wait out the storm. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered to him, a voice born of the mountains and the wild that told him not to hide, not to run. He wasn't alone anymore. The leopards had come into his life at a time when he'd thought he had nothing left to give. He had thought his solitude would be permanent, his existence a shadow of what it once was. But then they had appeared in the snow, injured and vulnerable. He had helped them, despite the risks, despite the fear that clung to his every thought. Now, they were here, in his cabin, a reminder that even in the most desolate places, life found a way to survive. They had shown him something he had forgotten, that even in the darkest times there was still room for connection, for trust. And whatever was outside the door now, it would not take that from him. His hand finally wrapped around the handle, and with a deep exhale, Gar twisted it and pulled the door open. The blast of cold air hit him like a physical force, but he barely flinched, his focus solely on the figure standing on the other side. The snow had stopped falling for the moment, but the wind still howled, whipping around the cabin like a living thing. In the doorway stood a man, his face hidden behind a scarf, but his eyes, sharp, intelligent eyes, were clearly visible. He was dressed in layers, heavy clothing designed to withstand the freezing temperatures, and his stance was solid, rooted to the snow beneath him. For a moment neither of them spoke. The storm roared behind the man, as if trying to drown out the silence that hung between them. Gar was the first to break it. "What do you want?" His voice was hoarse from both the cold and the uncertainty that still clung to him. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze flickered over Gar's shoulder, his eyes scanning the interior of the cabin. The leopards, who had been standing still, now began to move, slowly, cautiously, as they sensed the presence of another human. The male leopard's growl was low, almost imperceptible, but the stranger noticed it immediately. "I'm not here to harm you," the man said finally, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. He seemed to have an air of authority about him, like someone who had seen far too many winters to be easily intimidated. Gar didn't let go of the door handle. He was cautious, sizing the man up. There was something familiar about him, though Gar couldn't place it. The storm had a way of distorting everything, making people appear as if they were part of the landscape itself. But this man didn't seem like a wanderer, lost to the elements. There was a purpose in his eyes, a clarity in the way he stood. "Who are you?" Gar asked, though he knew he shouldn't trust strangers, not in a place like this. There were too many dangers in the wilderness, too many people with ill intentions. The man's gaze lingered on the leopards before he finally spoke. "My name's Darren. I've been tracking these two for some time." Gar's stomach churned. His heart skipped a beat. It took him a moment to process the meaning behind the words. Tracking them? Had Darren been following the leopards for weeks? Was he a poacher, one of the people who would kill to profit from the creature's pelts? The tension in Gar's body flared again. His instincts screamed at him to shut the door, to send this man away before things could escalate. But the leopards weren't reacting with hostility. They weren't showing any signs of aggression toward the stranger. In fact, the female leopard had even stepped a little closer to the man, her gaze curious as though she recognized something about him. "What do you want with them?" Gar asked, his voice sharp but laced with a layer of fear he couldn't suppress. Darren didn't immediately respond, but instead he turned his attention to the snow leopards. His eyes softened just for a moment before he looked back at Gar. "I'm not a threat. I'm here to help." Gar's suspicions only deepened. Help? How could this man help? The storm had thrown them together, but Gar had no idea who this Darren was or what his intentions were. "The leopards. They're endangered. They're rare," Darren continued. "I've been tracking them for months, trying to find them, trying to protect them. They're in danger from poachers." The word poachers hit Gar like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the conversation. The leopards had come to him injured, but they hadn't just been hurt by the storm. They had been hurt by humans. And now, a man was standing in front of him, claiming to have been following them. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Gar's words were filled with frustration. He wanted to trust the man, but he didn't know how. He had no idea if Darren was being honest or not. The danger surrounding the leopards was very real. The danger to Gar was real. Darren's eyes narrowed. "I couldn't risk leading the wrong people to them. I had to wait until the storm hit to track them safely. You've done the right thing by helping them, but they can't stay here forever." Gar stood there, frozen for a moment, processing what Darren had said. He'd brought the leopards in, despite the danger, despite the fear. But now, he realized the true weight of his decision. The leopards weren't just endangered, they were wanted. and not by people who wanted to protect them, but by those who would kill them. "What do we do now?" Gar finally asked, his voice quieter this time. "We need to get them to safety," Darren said, his voice steady but urgent. "There are wildlife experts nearby who can help. They can rehabilitate them, get them back into the wild where they belong. But we have to act quickly." Gar's mind whirled. He had taken the leopards in, thinking he was simply offering them a place to heal. But now he understood that he wasn't just a caretaker, he was part of a much larger fight. A fight to protect these creatures, to ensure that they didn't vanish from the mountains forever. The fire crackled in the background, but Gar barely heard it. He had a decision to make, a decision that would affect more than just him. He had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Would he send the leopards to safety trusting Darren, or would he risk everything to keep them, even if it meant endangering both their lives? For the first time in a long while, Gar felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly replaced by the weight of responsibility. The choice wasn't as simple as just opening the door. It was about choosing what kind of future he wanted to build, not just for himself, but for these wild creatures who had come to him in the middle of a storm. Gar stood at the threshold of his cabin, the wind howling around him, its icy fingers reaching in through the open door. The man, Darren, was still there, waiting for a response, his expression tense but patient. Inside, the leopards paced back and forth, their bodies moving with the grace and power that Gar had come to admire. Yet, beneath their strength, there was an undeniable vulnerability. Their injuries hadn't healed completely, and Gar wasn't sure if they could endure the strain of being moved just yet. The storm had subsided, but the cold remained, a constant reminder of the dangers outside. With a deep breath, Gar stepped aside, silently inviting Darren in. The door creaked as it closed behind him, and the warmth of the cabin enveloped them both. It was a relief, but it also brought a sense of unease, as if the safety of the cabin somehow made the outside world feel that much more dangerous. The leopards stopped pacing as soon as Darren entered. They studied him for a moment, their eyes flicking between Gar and the newcomer. The male leopard, the one Gar had named Arvid, gave a low, rumbling growl, as if unsure of Darren's intentions. But the female, whom Gar had named Alara, stepped forward with a quiet curiosity, her amber eyes never leaving Darren's face. "They recognize you," Gar said quietly, more to himself than to Darren. Darren nodded, his gaze softening as he took in the sight of the leopards. "They've seen me before. I've been tracking them, looking for them." His voice trailed off for a moment, and Gar noticed the faint sadness in his eyes, the weight of the knowledge he carried. He wasn't just here to help these animals, he was also bearing the responsibility of knowing what might happen if he failed. Gar watched as Darren slowly knelt down, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He didn't make eye contact with the leopards, instead extending his hands out at an angle, palms open and relaxed, as if giving them the space to decide for themselves. It took only a moment for Alara to approach him, her movements tentative but trusting. She sniffed the air around him, her nostrils flaring, before finally brushing her head against his extended hand. Darren's fingers gently stroked her fur, a soft sigh escaping him. He glanced up at Gar, a look of quiet understanding in his eyes. "They've been through a lot," Darren murmured. "But they're strong. They'll make it." Gar swallowed, the weight of the words settling into his chest. He wanted to believe that, but he wasn't sure. The leopards had come to him injured, their bodies marked by both nature and human cruelty. The trust they had placed in him, however tentative it was, felt like a fragile thread, one that could snap at any moment. "They're not ready to be moved," Gar said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know if he was trying to convince Darren or himself. Darren gave a small, understanding nod, his gaze never leaving the leopards. "I can see that, but we don't have a lot of time. If we don't get them to the experts soon, the risks of keeping them here outweigh the benefits. They'll be more vulnerable to poachers. And the longer they stay in one place, the harder it will be for them to reintegrate into the wild." Gar's mind raced. He had never considered the danger of staying in one place for too long. He had been focused on helping them heal, on giving them time to recover. But Darren was right. The world outside was not a safe place for these animals, and Gar wasn't prepared to put them at further risk. He walked over to the small table where a map lay open, the edges curled from years of use. His fingers traced the lines of the mountain passes, the pathways that led to the nearest wildlife sanctuary. It was a dangerous route, filled with hidden threats and unpredictable terrain, but it was the only option if the leopards were to survive. I can't move them yet," Gar said, his voice resolute. "But I'll help you get them to safety when they're—" Darren stood, his face hardening with determination. "We'll need to move quickly when the time comes. The poachers won't stop looking for them. And if we don't act soon, they might be lost forever. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Gar wasn't sure if he was ready to let go of the leopards. He had already come to care for them deeply, and the thought of sending them away was as painful as the day he had lost his family. But Darren was right. The leopards couldn't stay in isolation forever. They needed to be returned to the wild, to their rightful place. Finally, Gar nodded. "I'll get them ready." The next days passed in a quiet blur. Gar spent his time tending to the leopards, making sure they ate and rested. Their injuries were healing, but slowly. Arvid's leg was still weak, and Alara's side bore the faint scars of the wound she had suffered. But there was something more in their eyes now, something that hadn't been there when they first arrived. The wildness was returning. They were no longer entirely dependent on Gar for survival. They were becoming the creatures they were meant to be. And Gar? He found himself changing too. The isolation that had once felt like a refuge was now a cage. The leopards had opened something inside of him, something he had buried long ago. In their eyes he saw the reflection of his own loneliness, his own struggle to heal. But as he watched them grow stronger, Gar knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep them. They didn't belong to him. They belonged to the wild, to the mountains, to the places he could never go again. As the days passed and the storm outside subsided, Gar began to prepare. He knew it was time to let go. When the day finally came to say goodbye, it was a quiet, solemn moment. Darren arrived early, ready to take the leopards to the sanctuary. Gar stood by the door, watching as the two creatures stood side by side, their gaze fixed on the open world beyond the cabin. For a moment, they seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of the path ahead, but then Alara stepped forward, followed closely by Arvid. Together, they moved toward the door, their bodies graceful and strong. Gar's heart ached as he watched them go, but there was something in the way they moved that told him they would be all right. As Darren guided them out into the snow, Gar stayed in the doorway, his breath fogging in the cold air. The leopards turned back one last time, their eyes locking with his. For a fleeting moment, Gar thought he saw something like gratitude in their gaze. And then, they were gone. He closed the door, leaning against it with a deep sigh. The silence of the cabin was deafening, but somehow, it felt different now. There was peace in it, the kind of peace that came from knowing he had done the right thing. And though he had let them go, he knew they would never be truly gone from his heart. The wind outside howled again, but it no longer felt as oppressive. The storm that had so fiercely gripped the mountains seemed to have softened, its fury now a distant rumble. Gar stood still for a long moment in the quiet of the cabin, his gaze drifting over the bare floor where the leopards had once moved with a silent grace. The space felt larger now, emptier, like something precious had been taken, and the void left behind was impossible to fill. It was still early, the morning sky pale and clouded with the remnants of snow. The mountains stretched out beyond his cabin, their jagged peaks rising into the distance, veiled in the gray mist of a thawing storm. Gar had come to love these mountains, with all their wild beauty and their silent, cold embrace. But now, they seemed less like home, and more like a reminder of his own isolation. He had let them go. The leopards were no longer his responsibility, their future uncertain but freer than it had ever been. But that freedom, as Gar had learned, came with its own cost. Gar moved toward the small window overlooking the forest, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of them. He knew that they would be gone by now, long past the threshold of his cabin, but his mind could not help but replay the moment when they had left, when he had let them go. Had it been the right thing to do? A knock at the door startled him out of his reverie. For a brief moment he almost didn't answer. It had been a long time since anyone had visited, and the isolation was a comfort. But curiosity won out, and he made his way to the door. It was Darren again. "Did they make it?" Gar asked, his voice thick with the remnants of emotion he had struggled to contain. Darren gave a small, weary smile. "They did. They're on their way to the sanctuary. I've seen them move farther into the wilderness. They're strong." The words hit Gar like a soft blow to the chest. They were safe. They were out there, where they belonged. He closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of it lifting from his shoulders. "I wasn't sure if I'd made the right decision," he confessed, his voice raw. "Letting them go." "You did," Darren said, his tone unshaken. "They needed you, but they also needed to be free. You gave them that. You gave them a chance." Gar nodded slowly, taking in Darren's words. They weren't easy to accept, but they rang with truth. The leopards were resilient. They had survived this long because of their strength and instincts, and now they had the opportunity to thrive, to return to the wild where they belonged. "You're right," Gar murmured, almost to himself. "It was the right thing to do." Darren studied him for a moment, then stepped forward, his gaze firm. "There's something else, Gar. You need to know this." He paused for a beat before continuing. "The poachers, the ones who wounded them, they won't stop looking for them. They'll be back. They always come back." The words landed heavily, and Gar felt a cold shiver run through him. He had known that the leopards were in danger from poachers, but hearing Darren speak it so plainly brought the reality crashing into focus. The leopards were free for now, but that freedom was fragile. "What can we do?" Gar asked, his voice tinged with urgency. "How can we stop them?" Darren hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "There's not much we can do alone, but there are others, people in the village. If we act quickly, we might be able to keep an eye on the area. We can track the poachers and alert the authorities." Gar nodded, his mind already racing. He wasn't about to let the leopards fall back into danger, not after all they had been through. He had been a recluse for so long, but in that moment, he realized he couldn't remain isolated, not anymore. He had a responsibility, not just to the leopards, but to the wilderness itself. "Let's do it," Gar said with quiet determination. The next few days were filled with activity. Darren gathered the few people in the village who were willing to help, and together they began to track the poachers. Gar's skills in the mountains proved invaluable as they followed the signs of human presence, boot prints in the snow, broken branches, the faint scent of smoke in the air. The poachers were close, too close. As they trekked deeper into the wilderness, the weight of their mission hung heavy in the cold air. They were fighting against an enemy that had no face, an enemy that operated in the shadows, hidden from the eyes of the law. But Gar wasn't afraid. He had seen what these poachers were capable of, and he would not allow them to harm the creatures he had come to care for. One night, as the snow fell thick and fast, the group set up camp near a ridge overlooking a small valley. From here, they could see the tracks they had been following for days. Gar peered through the dark, his heart pounding. Then, a shape moved in the distance. The unmistakable form of a man, crouched low and watching the horizon. "They're here," Darren whispered, his voice tense. Gar's pulse quickened. They were closer now. But there was something else, a sound, a low growl, faint but distinct. The leopards. They were out there. Suddenly, the air shifted. A breeze carried the scent of something familiar, something wild. "They're close," Gar said, his voice barely a murmur. The night stretched on, the tension mounting with each passing hour. But just before dawn, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Arvid, the male leopard, his body sleek and strong, his eyes glinting with recognition as he scanned the area. Alara was not far behind him, her graceful form cutting through the snow. They had come back. Gar's heart swelled with relief and awe as he watched them, the bond they shared transcending the years of silence and solitude. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind stilled. The snow fell gently around them. The leopards stood together, side by side, as if they knew they were safe, at least for the time being. And in that moment, Gar understood. They were no longer his to protect. They were guardians of the wild, as much a part of the mountains as the peaks that rose into the heavens. And he had become part of their story. The bond they shared, born of shared survival and understanding, would never fade. Gar could finally let go. The wind picked up again, swirling around Gar like an ancient spirit, carrying with it the weight of his past. His eyes stayed fixed on the leopards, their sleek forms moving through the snow with effortless grace, their eyes always alert. It was impossible not to admire their strength, their survival instinct, their ability to thrive in the harshest of conditions. In a way, they mirrored him, both of them survivors in a world that demanded more than they could give. As the leopards melted back into the shadows of the forest, Gar's mind drifted, just as it always did, back to the ghosts that haunted him. The ghosts of the past he couldn't outrun. It had been years since his wife had died, but the pain was still fresh, as raw and jagged as the mountains surrounding him. They had met when they were young, wild, and full of dreams. He had thought the world could be conquered with her by his side. They had traveled together, seen the world in ways few others ever would. But then, tragedy had struck, and his world had shattered. The memories haunted him in the quiet moments. His wife's laughter, the softness of her touch, the way she had looked at him with love and trust. Those memories felt like a betrayal now. She was gone, and all he had left was the echo of her voice, whispering in the back of his mind. He had tried to drown the pain in the isolation of the mountains, hoping that the snow would bury it along with everything else. But it never worked. The loss had taken something from him. It had turned him into someone who could barely look at the people around him without feeling the weight of their expectations, their pity. His retreat into the mountains hadn't been a choice. It had been the only thing he could do to survive. but it had never stopped the ghosts from following him. He had hidden himself away, convinced that the world didn't need him anymore, that he no longer belonged in it. But then the leopards had come into his life, as if the mountains themselves had decided to force him out of his own darkness. They were wild, untamed, just like him, and they had needed him. Gaur thought about that moment, just before he had let the leopards go. It had been the hardest decision of his life, but it had been the right one. He knew that now. They belonged in the wild, not in the cage he had built for himself. The leopards, in their silent grace, had taught him something important. Freedom was worth more than anything else. He had given them that. But even as he let them go, Gaur knew he had let go of more than just the leopards. He had finally begun to let go of the ghosts of his past, the grief that had anchored him to a life he no longer wanted. The sun had begun to dip low on the horizon, casting the mountains in a golden glow. Gaur stood at the edge of his cabin, his thoughts still tangled with the past, but he was no longer running from it. The weight had shifted. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer had a hold on him. The sound of footsteps broke through his reverie. Darren was approaching, his boots crunching through the snow. The old man had been a steadfast companion during the past few weeks, offering wisdom and support as Gaur adjusted to his new reality. "You look like a man who's found peace," Darren said, his voice low but warm. Gaur nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the distant peaks. "I've found something," he replied quietly. "It's not peace, but it's close." Darren smiled faintly, his breath visible in the cold evening air. "You've done more than you think. You saved them. You gave them a chance." Gaur turned to face him, his eyes meeting Darren's with a newfound clarity. "Maybe, but I also gave myself a chance to stop running." The words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Darren didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced up at the sky, where the last light of the day flickered like a fading ember. "There's something else you should know," he said softly. "The poachers, they've been spotted again. A few days ago, not far from here, they're still looking." The news hit Gaur like a cold gust of wind. He had hoped, even after everything, that the leopards would be safe, that they would have the freedom they deserved without the constant threat of danger looming over them. But the world didn't work that way. Not for the leopards, not for anyone. "We need to act," Gaur said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We can't let them come back." Darren studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Agreed, but this time we'll need more than just the village. We'll need a plan, something bigger. These poachers, they're not just after the leopards, they're after everything that's valuable in these mountains." Gaur turned back toward the trees, his mind already racing. He couldn't lose them, not after everything they had been through together. The leopards, the mountains, the life he had begun to reclaim, all of it was at risk. And this time, he would fight to protect it. "It won't be easy," Gaur said, more to himself than to Darren. "But I won't let them destroy this, not again." Darren was silent for a moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Gaur. We'll do what we can. Together." Together. It was a word Gaur hadn't thought much about in years, but now, as the reality of the poachers' threat loomed over them, it felt like the first step towards something bigger, something worth fighting for. The mountains had been his refuge, his prison, and his home. But now, they were something more. They were a place where he could finally stand tall, no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past, but ready to face the future with all the strength he had left. And whatever came next, Gaur knew he wasn't running anymore. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Gaur's mind, still gripped by the weight of his decision to protect the leopards, kept returning to the urgent need to act. The mountains that had been his sanctuary now felt like a battleground. Nature was beautiful, but it was unforgiving. Survival here wasn't a luxury, it was a constant, brutal struggle. The bitter wind, the deep snow, and the ever-present danger of predators and poachers all made every decision a matter of life and death. Gaur had always thought he knew the mountains, but there were layers to the wilderness that even he hadn't fully understood. The deeper he delved into his plan to protect the leopards, the more he realized how vulnerable he was, not just physically, but emotionally. These mountains had taken so much from him already. Would they take the leopards too? "Gaur!" Darren's voice broke through his thoughts one morning as they stood outside the cabin, looking out at the snow-covered valley. "You can't do this alone. You need to prepare. It's not just about hiding the leopards anymore. It's about fortifying your position. Poachers won't stop unless they're made to." The old man's words were like a cold wind cutting through Gaur's resolve. They were true, and yet every fiber of Gaur's being rebelled against the idea of further complicating his life. But Darren had lived through enough winters to know how to survive and how to protect those who mattered. Gaur, despite his deep connection with the land, realized he needed Darren now more than ever. "We'll need to move them," Darren continued, his gaze narrowing in determination. "Into the higher caves, somewhere the poachers haven't found, somewhere they won't think to look. But we can't waste time. Every hour you delay could be one where the poachers move in closer." The urgency in Darren's voice made Gar's pulse quicken. He had no choice but to trust the old man. Time was running out. "Let's move them then," Gar said, his voice tight with resolve. His gaze shifted to the two snow leopards who were now cautiously moving through the forest's edge. They had grown stronger since the day he'd brought them in, their muscles rippling under their coats of silvery fur, but Gower knew the wild was never forgiving. It had never been kind to him, and it wouldn't be kind to them either. As they prepared to relocate the leopards to a higher, safer cave, Gower's mind kept returning to the question of why. Why had the leopards come to him in the first place? Had they sought him out, knowing his own wounds were raw, or had it been pure chance? And why did he feel this deep, inexplicable connection with them? Was it simply survival, or was there something deeper, some bond that went beyond mere necessity? He caught a glimpse of the leopards as they sat quietly near the edge of the clearing. Their eyes, like pools of liquid gold, were fixed on him. There was something in those eyes, a silent understanding. They were trusting him now. He had become their protector, their savior. But in protecting them, was he saving himself too? With Darren leading the way, Gar took the first steps toward the higher caves. They moved swiftly but carefully, weaving through the snow-laden trees. It wasn't an easy task. Snowstorms and blizzards had obscured the paths Gar knew so well. The deeper they went into the mountains, the more the wilderness seemed to swallow them whole, a dark and silent place where every step felt uncertain. The air grew colder as they ascended, and the shadows lengthened, but Gar wasn't afraid of the night or the cold. The true threat, the real danger, was the poachers. He had seen the destruction they caused in the past. Traps set for animals, forests stripped of their beauty, and the ruthless greed of those who would harm anything that stood in their way. They reached the cave by dusk, a jagged, windswept cliff that had been weathered by years of storms. It was hidden well, tucked away from the usual paths. The leopards seemed to recognize it immediately, their instincts guiding them to safety. The air was thin and biting, but inside the cave, they would be protected. Gar wasn't sure if the leopards fully understood what was at stake, but he did. "I'll stay here with them tonight," Gar said, turning to Darren. "You should go back and get supplies. We can't risk moving them again too soon." Darren nodded, though his eyes were filled with concern. "You can't be too careful, Gar. Keep your eyes open. If the poachers are close, we might not have much time." Gar watched as Darren descended back down the mountain, his figure quickly disappearing into the swirling snow. Alone now, with only the leopards for company, Gar couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled through the trees, sending gusts of snow flying in all directions. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of the wind seemed to echo in the silence. His heart began to beat faster as he sat, watching the leopards settle into their new home. They were calm now, but Gar could sense the tension in the air. They too knew that danger was nearby. The night stretched on in eerie stillness, and Gar's thoughts turned again to his past. How many years had he spent hiding from the world? And now, here he was, in the coldest, most desolate corner of the mountains, fighting to protect creatures that could never fully repay him. He hadn't expected this. He had expected isolation, perhaps the quiet peace of being left alone to mourn. But instead, he had found a cause. And with that cause, he found something else, a reason to keep going. But the shadows in the snow grew deeper with every passing hour, and Gar knew with chilling certainty that the storm had only just begun. The moonlight filtered weakly through the swirling snow, casting pale shadows across the cave's jagged walls. Gar sat in the corner, his back against the cold stone, watching as the snow leopards huddled together for warmth. Their silvery coats shimmered against the backdrop of darkness, and their deep, golden eyes gleamed faintly in the low light. Despite the beauty of the moment, Gar felt an oppressive weight in the air, an unsettling tension that he couldn't shake. It had been hours since Darren had left, and Gar's mind kept returning to the poachers. The tracks in the snow hadn't been easy to read, but he was certain someone had been following them. The wind, though fierce, hadn't erased all the signs. The faint outlines of boots, the subtle imprints of weight pressing down on the snow, were scattered across the mountain trail leading toward the cave. Whoever it was, they knew the land as well as Gar did. He stood up slowly, his muscles stiff from the cold and the long hours spent in the cave. The leopards, sensing his movement, looked up from their resting place, their eyes alert but not fearful. They had come to trust him, to understand that he would keep them safe. Gar could feel that trust pressing against him like a silent weight. He stepped toward the entrance, feeling the biting wind cut into him as he approached the cave's opening. The snowstorm had not let up. If anything, it had intensified, the flurries swirling violently in every direction. Yet through the chaos, Gar could still see the faint outlines of tracks in the snow, heading directly toward the cave. His heart sank. There was no mistaking it now. The poachers were close. He quickly turned to the leopards, their gaze never leaving him as he crouched down, his voice low but firm. "Stay here, stay quiet." The leopards didn't move, merely watching him, as if understanding that the danger was real. Gar couldn't afford to panic. His training in the mountains, his survival instincts honed over the years, kicked in. He knew what he had to do. Gar backed away from the entrance slowly, retreating into the deeper shadows of the cave. His mind raced as he considered his options. The poachers wouldn't enter the cave without knowing exactly what they were after. They would wait, perhaps, until daylight broke through the storm, using the cover of the storm to track their quarry. Gar knew that if he could buy enough time, Darren might return with reinforcements, or at least with enough supplies to help them escape the poachers' notice. But there was no guarantee of that. The poachers weren't just men. They were hunters of the highest order, skilled in tracking, ruthless in their pursuit. If they caught wind of the leopard's presence, they wouldn't stop until they had their prize. A sudden noise from outside the cave made Gar freeze, a low, grating sound, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. Someone was near. He instinctively reached for the hunting knife he kept strapped to his side, the cool metal a comfort in the face of the unknown. He crouched low, moving toward the back of the cave, where a small alcove provided some concealment. His heart pounded in his chest as the noise grew louder, closer. The poachers were here. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees outside, but Gar could hear the crunch of boots against snow, deliberate and patient. They were trying to be quiet, but they weren't trying hard enough. Gar's sharp eyes caught sight of movement in the distance. Two figures. He could make out the vague shapes of them through the snow, moving in tandem, as if they were accustomed to working together. They were hunting. Gar's grip tightened on his knife. He had no choice now but to act. He silently motioned to the leopards, signaling for them to stay hidden as he crept toward the back of the cave, closer to the narrow passage that would lead them to the hidden paths deeper in the mountain. But his mind kept returning to the leopards. If he took them into the higher caves, would the poachers follow? Would they risk moving deeper into the wilderness, into more dangerous terrain, to track their prey? Time was running out. The poachers were almost at the entrance. Gar could feel the tension in the air, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as the sound of their breathing reached his ears. They were close, too close. A thought flashed through his mind, distraction. It was the only chance they had. Moving quickly, he grabbed a handful of loose stones and hurled them toward the far side of the cave. The sound of the rocks clattering across the floor echoed off the walls, bouncing back in multiple directions. For a brief moment the poachers hesitated. They were listening, trying to figure out what had made the noise. Gar used the moment to slip toward the back of the cave, where a small tunnel led to the upper ridges. His breath came in shallow gasps as he moved. The snow leopards, still alert, followed his lead, their feet silent against the cold stone floor. He motioned for them to follow him into the narrow passage. Once he was out of sight, he paused, turning back to make sure the poachers hadn't found their way into the cave yet. The cave's entrance was quiet now, eerily so. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. They had to move, and fast. The snowstorm outside intensified, blurring the view ahead, but Gar felt the surge of adrenaline as his feet carried him upward toward the higher caves. The narrow passage wound around the rocky ridges of the mountain, slick with ice and snow, but it was his only hope. He had to get the leopards out of harm's way before it was too late. And yet, the thought gnawed at him. What if the poachers had already tracked them here? What if there was no way to escape? His heart thundered in his chest, each step carrying him further from the safety of his cabin and deeper into the unknown. The mountains, which had been his home for so long, were suddenly foreign. They had become a battleground, and the poachers were closing in. Gar gripped the leopard's food supply tightly, his eyes scanning the dark, snowy landscape ahead. Every step could be the difference between life and death. For them, for him, for the leopards he had promised to protect. The storm raged on, but there was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and he would face whatever came next. The storm outside had become a living thing, howling through the crags and ravines of the mountain as if it were in pursuit of something or someone. Gar's breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air biting at his lungs as he moved further into the narrow passage. The path was treacherous, the snow underfoot slick and uneven, but he didn't slow. Every moment mattered. Every minute that passed, the poachers were closer to finding the cave, closer to the leopards. He could not let them get there first. The leopards, moving with quiet precision behind him, were unaccustomed to such harsh conditions. Their thick fur coats helped protect them from the cold, but even they were struggling to keep pace. Gar occasionally glanced back, offering them silent encouragement as they followed his lead, their paws leaving faint prints in the snow behind them. As they ascended higher into the mountains, the terrain became more treacherous. The wind grew fiercer, howling through the crevices like a wild, vengeful spirit. But Gar pushed forward. He had no choice. The poachers were ruthless. He'd seen their kind before, hunters who preyed on the weak, driven by greed, not by survival. They wouldn't hesitate to kill for a price. He couldn't let them take the leopards. They were far too important, not just to the ecosystem, but to him. In the short time they had been together, they had come to represent something he had long lost: trust, hope, and the chance for redemption. The mountains were unforgiving, and Gar knew the leopards couldn't make it alone through these harsh conditions. They needed shelter. They needed protection. He pushed on, the wind howling in his ears, the snow swirling around them like a thick curtain. His eyes scanned the ridgelines ahead, looking for any sign of danger, any hint that the poachers had found their way into the higher caves. Suddenly, a faint noise caught his attention, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The sound of boots crunching in the snow, drawing nearer. His heart skipped a beat, his instincts screaming at him to act. He motioned for the leopards to stop, and they complied, crouching low in the snow, blending into the landscape. Gar crouched beside them, pressing his body against the cold, icy rock. He dared a glance over his shoulder. The poachers had found the path. He could make out the silhouettes of two men against the snowstorm's fury, their forms hazy but moving with purpose, their heads down as they trudged forward. They were searching for something, or someone. His chest tightened. They were getting closer, and soon they would see the prints in the snow, signs of life, of movement that could lead them straight to the leopards. But Gar wasn't going to let that happen. He wouldn't let these creatures, who had already suffered so much, be killed for the sake of greed. His mind raced as he formulated a plan. He needed a distraction, something to throw them off the trail, something that would give him and the leopards a fighting chance. The poachers were moving closer, the wind biting at their faces as they pushed through the snow. Gar could hear their voices now, low murmurs carried by the storm, but he couldn't make out the words. He gripped the knife at his side, the steel cold against his hand, and silently signaled to the leopards to stay put. His heart pounded as he moved farther up the ridge, keeping to the shadows. The poachers were within range now, the gap between them closing. Every instinct in Gar's body screamed to stay hidden, to remain silent. But he couldn't wait any longer. He had to act. With a deep breath, he grabbed a large rock from the ground and hurled it into the open space ahead of the poachers. The noise was deafening, the rock crashing against the rocks and sending an avalanche of smaller stones tumbling down the slope. The poachers stopped dead in their tracks, their heads snapping up toward the sound. Gar didn't hesitate. He sprang into action, darting to the side and rushing up the ridge, using the storm and the terrain to his advantage. The poachers shouted to each other, their voices rising in confusion and alarm as they scrambled to understand what was happening. But Gar had already disappeared into the storm. His heart raced as he maneuvered through the snow, his breath quick and shallow in the bitter cold. Behind him, he could hear the poachers cursing, their boots crunching through the snow as they followed the sounds of his footsteps. But Gar was already ahead, moving faster than they could. The snow leopards followed in his wake, moving with grace and agility through the snow, their instincts guiding them through the storm. The leopards were hunters themselves, accustomed to navigating the wilds. Gar could feel their presence behind him, a silent, powerful force. He turned quickly, slipping into a narrow ravine that wound deeper into the mountain's belly. The poachers would have to follow, but it wouldn't be easy. The path was narrow, winding, and treacherous. One wrong step, and they could easily lose their footing and slide down into the ravine below. The poachers' pursuit was relentless. Gar could hear them shouting, urging each other to hurry, but he was already a step ahead, leading the leopards toward the safety of the higher caves. The storm was so fierce now that he could barely see a few feet ahead of him, but he trusted his instincts, trusted the land. He knew the mountain, knew the trails, the hidden paths. It wasn't long before the poachers' shouts began to fade into the distance. The sounds of their pursuit grew quieter as the storm swallowed them up. Gar stopped, listening, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't see them anymore, couldn't hear them. Had they given up? Or were they still close behind? He didn't wait to find out. Gar pushed on, the snow leopards following him, their footfalls light but determined. Hours passed before the storm finally began to subside. The wind died down, and the snowflakes, which had been swirling around him in every direction, started to fall gently. The air became still, the oppressive weight of the storm lifting as the mountain was blanketed in a pristine layer of white. Gore paused at the entrance to a cave, breathing heavily. They had made it. He turned to look back at the leopards, who were now resting, their eyes scanning the horizon. They seemed to sense the danger had passed, their bodies relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. But Gower knew the fight wasn't over. The poachers could still be out there, tracking them. He had bought them time. But would it be enough? Only time would tell. The cave provided a temporary sanctuary, the rough stone walls sheltering them from the blizzard's remnants. The wind had slowed to a mere whisper, and the only sound now was the occasional scrape of snow against the rocks and the soft breaths of the snow leopards. Gar sat at the entrance, his back against the cold stone, eyes scanning the landscape. He didn't trust the calm. The storm might have passed, but it wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had led the leopards to this cave not out of necessity, but out of instinct. It was a place he knew well, remote and hidden, a part of the mountain where few would think to venture. He needed to make sure they were safe here before he could fully relax. His eyes darted across the snow-covered plains below, his heart still heavy with the weight of what he'd just done. It had been a close call, far too close for comfort. The leopards, now settled in the shelter of the cave, began to rest as well, their breaths coming slowly and evenly. Gar took a long look at them, his expression softening. He had come to care for them deeply over the past few weeks, more than he had anticipated. They were wild creatures, fierce and independent, but in those moments when their eyes met his, there was a silent understanding, an unspoken bond that grew stronger with each passing day. The wild instincts that had led them here in the first place were still sharp, but so was their trust in him. It had been earned, slowly, through every shared moment of survival. But that trust wasn't enough to protect them from the real danger, the poachers. They were still out there, hunting, waiting for the right moment to strike. Gower's mind raced. The only way to truly keep them safe was to move them away from the poachers' reach. But the thought of leaving this remote area, of abandoning the small sanctuary they had found, felt wrong. This was their home, for now, their only chance at survival. He wasn't going to let that slip through his fingers. His thoughts were interrupted by a low growl, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. It was one of the leopards, the larger one, the male. He was standing at the cave's entrance, his body tense, muscles coiled as if ready to spring at an unseen threat. Gower stood slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his waist. The male leopard's eyes never left the horizon, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. Gower could feel the shift in the air, the tension rising. The poachers had not given up. They were close, too close for comfort. Gower stepped forward cautiously, moving beside the leopard. "Stay," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. The big cat's gaze flicked to him for a brief moment before returning to the snow-covered landscape. Gower knew the leopard could sense something he could not, something dangerous, something that didn't belong. The snow around them stirred as another presence made itself known. A shape moved in the distance, a shadow against the snow. It was faint at first, but then clearer, a figure moving with deliberate purpose, closing in on the cave. Gower's pulse quickened. The poachers were here. There was no time to hesitate. He glanced back at the leopards, their bodies still and alert, waiting for his next move. Gower didn't need to tell them what to do. They had already made up their minds. Their bond had deepened beyond mere survival. The leopards were ready to fight for him, as much as he was ready to fight for them. With a silent nod to the leopard, Gower moved into position. He knew the terrain, he knew the risks, but he couldn't afford to let them take the leopards, not after everything they had been through together. The first poacher was barely visible, crouched low in the snow as he crept toward the cave entrance. Gower could make out the distinct shape of the man's rifle, the unmistakable outline of a predator looking for prey. The male leopard growled low again, his voice a deep rumble in the silence of the mountain. Gower motioned for the leopard to wait, his fingers brushing the snow-covered ground, ready to spring into action. A second poacher emerged, this one moving swiftly, his gaze darting around as if expecting to find something, or someone, hidden. Gower clenched his fists, the cold biting into his skin, but he didn't move. He was waiting for the right moment. As the second poacher advanced, the male leopard surged forward in one fluid motion, launching itself from its hiding place like a shadow in the night. The poacher never saw it coming. Gower heard the sickening thud of claws meeting flesh, followed by a startled shout. The poacher's body crumpled to the ground, the wind knocked from his lungs in a gasp. The first poacher turned just in time to see his partner fall, his rifle fumbling in his hands. "Get back!" the poacher shouted, but it was too late. The male leopard was already circling, its claws flashing in the dim light, and the second leopard, the female, emerged from the shadows, her growl filling the air. Gar didn't wait. He charged forward, using the confusion as his advantage. With a single swift movement, he knocked the poacher's rifle from his hands, the force of the blow sending the weapon skidding across the ice. He held the poacher by the throat, his grip firm, his eyes cold with determination. "You're not going to hurt them," Gar said, his voice low but filled with an unyielding intensity. The poacher's eyes widened in fear as Gar tightened his grip. He didn't need to say more. The poacher knew the fight was over. The female leopard, standing at Gar's side, let out a low growl of approval as she surveyed the scene. She was calm, poised, a predator in her own right. The two poachers, now disarmed and defeated, had no choice but to retreat. "You'll leave, and you'll never come back," Gar said coldly, pushing the poacher away, sending him stumbling back toward the ridge. Without a word, the poachers scrambled, retreating into the blizzard from which they had emerged. Gar stood motionless for a moment, watching them go, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had won for now, but the cost of this fight weighed heavily on his shoulders. The leopards were safe for now, but he knew this would not be the last battle. The wild called to them, and Gar had to answer. As the snowstorm began to wane, leaving behind a trail of destruction and the smell of blood, Gar stood in the middle of the rocky plateau, watching the two poachers disappear into the blizzard. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. The adrenaline of the fight still pulsed in his veins. He could feel the weight of his actions, the cost of what he had just done. But he couldn't let the thought linger too long. There were more important things at stake now. The leopards were watching him. Their golden eyes, full of unspoken trust and understanding, were fixed on him, waiting for him to make his next move. The male leopard stood tall, his muscles still tense, his hackles raised, as though ready to leap into action if the poachers returned. The female, however, was quieter, more contemplative, her gaze softening as she looked at Gar. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, his body still in the aftershock of the encounter. His mind was racing. The leopards were safe this time. But for how long? He glanced back toward the mountain pass, the path leading down to the dense forest. It was a dangerous journey for them, one that Gar knew they would not make easily. The wilderness was unforgiving, especially for creatures who had only just begun to heal. The leopards needed more than just shelter. They needed the wild, the freedom to roam and hunt as they were meant to. It was the only way they would ever be whole again. But the thought of letting them go, of releasing them into the unknown, where dangers like poachers, predators, and the bitter cold of the mountains could easily claim them, was more than Gar could bear. He had spent weeks caring for them, nurturing their injuries, earning their trust. The bond they shared was deep and unspoken, a connection born out of shared struggle. And now, it seemed he was being asked to let them go, to give them up to the wild that had never really been theirs to begin with. His chest tightened, and for a moment he felt as though the weight of the mountain itself was pressing down on him. "They belong in the wild, Gar," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the howling wind. But what if the wild doesn't want them? He had no answer. The thought of releasing them felt like a betrayal, but keeping them here, locked in this small corner of the world, felt just as wrong. They were not pets, not creatures to be tamed. They were wild, beautiful animals who needed their freedom, the open expanse of the snow-covered mountains, the vast forests where they could roam without fear. But could he trust that they would survive without him? Could he really walk away from the leopards who had come to depend on him? And what if the poachers came back as he feared they would? Could he stand by and watch them fall again, only to be taken by men who would never understand their beauty, their strength? Gar's heart ached as he looked at them. They were so close now, the bond between them palpable in the air. They had fought together, survived together, and now he had to make the hardest decision of all. He looked up at the mountains that stretched beyond the ridge, the winds now calm but still carrying the echoes of the storm. The leopards needed to go. He could feel it in his bones. He had given them his protection, but he could not be their shield forever. They were not meant to be caged by his love. With a heavy sigh, Gar knelt down, his hand resting on the snow-covered ground. The male leopard, ever the protector, stepped forward, brushing his large head against Gar's chest. The gesture was a quiet one, full of affection and trust. "It's time," Gar murmured. His voice was thick with emotion. "You need to be free." The female leopard padded forward, her eyes softening as she nuzzled his hand. There was no need for words now. They understood. But Gar's heart still thudded painfully in his chest. This was the hardest thing he had ever done. It felt like tearing apart a part of himself, like severing a connection that had been forged in the fires of their shared struggle. With trembling hands, Gar stood. "I'll never forget you," he said softly, his voice rough. He paused, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "I hope you'll remember me." The leopards stared at him for a long moment, their golden eyes shining with something unspoken. Then, as though the weight of his decision had been accepted, the male leopard turned and bounded toward the opening of the cave, followed closely by the female. Gar watched them disappear into the snowy wilderness, the sound of their paws soft against the snow. His chest tightened with a mixture of grief and pride. He had given them the one thing they had needed the most, their freedom. And yet, in the deepest part of him, Gar knew that a part of him would always remain with them, wherever they went. They had changed him, reshaped him, made him remember the wildness that he had lost so long ago. The mountain wind howled again, but this time it was a different sound, a call, a whisper on the wind that carried the voices of the snow leopards, a final goodbye and a promise of something greater. As Gar turned to walk back to his cabin, the weight on his shoulders seemed lighter. He had done the right thing. The leopards were free, and in that freedom, they would find the life they had always deserved. But even as the mountain passed into the quiet of the evening, Gar could not shake the feeling that something more awaited them, something beyond the horizon, something that only the snow leopards knew. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would find the answer in the footsteps they left behind. Gar stood by the door of his cabin, staring out into the dark expanse of the mountains. The snow had begun to fall again, light and steady, blanketing the world in a quiet shroud. He had watched the leopards disappear into the storm, the finality of the moment settling heavily in his chest. For a long time he didn't move. He simply stood there, as the wind whispered through the trees and the soft flakes of snow drifted past. His fingers were numb, but not from the cold. It was the numbness that came from loss, the kind that settled deep inside, a heaviness in the heart that never fully lifted. The cabin behind him felt hollow now, as though it had been emptied of something essential. For weeks, it had been filled with the leopard's presence. Their cautious movements, their quiet growls, the soft rustle of their fur as they slept. Now the silence seemed too loud, too empty. The weight of it pressed against him, but he knew it was necessary. "They're out there," Gar whispered to himself, his breath clouding in the cold air, "in the wild, where they belong." And yet, he could not escape the nagging doubt that lingered at the edges of his thoughts. Had he done enough? Had he truly prepared them for the dangers of the wild? He had done what he could, but the mountains were unforgiving, and the threats, poachers, predators, the harsh elements were many. But there was nothing more he could do now. He had given them their freedom. That was all he could offer. Gar turned slowly, his eyes lingering on the empty space where the leopards had once rested. He had cared for them, healed their wounds, and in return, they had given him a gift, a connection to something bigger than himself, something wild and untamed. In their eyes, he had seen a reflection of his own pain, his own loss, and in their survival, he had found a sense of purpose. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, lost in his thoughts, but eventually, he stepped away from the door and made his way to the table. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warm glow offering a stark contrast to the cold silence that hung in the room. He sank into a chair, his mind heavy, but for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of peace. For the first time, he didn't feel completely alone. As Gar stared into the flames, the weight of the past seemed to loosen its grip on him, just a little. The memories of his old life, the life he had left behind, still haunted him, but they no longer felt as sharp, as all-consuming. The leopards had reminded him of something he had forgotten, that there was beauty in living for something greater than yourself, that there was value in the quiet moments, the ones where the world seemed still and full of possibility. But Gar knew that this chapter in his life had come to an end. The leopards had left, and with their departure he had to find a new way forward. The solitude that had once defined him would no longer be enough. He needed something more, something that gave him purpose beyond his own pain. There was a knock at the door, light but persistent, breaking through his thoughts like a shard of glass. Gar blinked in surprise, unsure of who would be out here in the middle of the storm. He rose from the chair, his feet heavy with the weight of his emotions. His hands were still cold, the remnants of his grief clinging to him like a second skin, but he made his way to the door, his heart beating a little faster, as though the knock itself had stirred something deep within him. When he opened the door, the wind swept in, swirling around him, but it was not the cold that made his breath catch in his chest. It was the figure standing before him. It was an older man, His face weathered and worn by years spent in the wilderness, his eyes sharp and knowing. He wore a thick cloak, a rifle slung over his shoulder, and he carried with him an air of authority that made Gar stand straighter. "Thought I might find you here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. He paused, his gaze flicking past Gar to the empty space behind him, where the leopards had once been. "You're the one who helped them," the man continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The snow leopards." Gar felt his chest tighten. He had known this moment would come eventually. He had known that someone would find out, that someone would come looking for the leopards. He had hoped it would be someone who understood, someone who could see beyond the animals' beauty and recognize their worth. "Who are you?" Gar asked, his voice steady but low. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Name's Tavis. I've been tracking the pair for a while now. They've been spotted in these mountains before, but we didn't know where exactly they were." Gar's heart skipped a beat. He had been so careful, so protective of the leopards, that he hadn't considered the possibility of someone else being out here, searching for them. "What do you want with them?" Gar's voice was quieter now, his protective instincts rising to the surface. Tavis met his gaze with an unwavering look. "I work with a group of wildlife experts. We've been trying to track them for a long time. They're a rare breed, and we need to make sure they're safe from poachers, from people who would see them as nothing more than trophies." Gar's breath caught. He had known deep down that there was a risk the leopards could be taken again, but hearing it spoken out loud made the reality of it even more frightening. "They've gone," Gar said softly, his gaze falling to the ground. "I set them free." Tavis studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I figured as much. You've got the look of someone who understands what it means to protect them." He paused, his eyes softening. "You did the right thing, but you'll need to keep an eye on them. They're not out of danger." Gar nodded, his throat tight. "I'll do whatever I can. I won't let anyone take." The man gave him a small smile. "I know. That's why I'm here." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Gar felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was still a way to help the leopards. Maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't over yet. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Gar felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was still a way to help the leopards. Maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't over yet. As Tavis stepped into the cabin, the wind howled once more, but this time, it didn't feel quite as lonely. Gar knew that the mountains had more to offer him than he had realized, and that the journey he had started with the leopards was far from finished. The storm outside had not let up, but Gar felt a strange sense of warmth in the presence of Tavis, a man whose knowledge of the mountains seemed to run as deep as the snow that coated them. As the wind howled against the walls of the cabin, the two men sat by the hearth, the crackling fire casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Tavis, a seasoned tracker with years of experience in the wild, was examining a map spread out on the table. The dim light from the fire reflected off his weathered face, giving him a ghostly appearance as though he were more a part of the wilderness than a man. "You've done well with them," Tavis said, his voice low but steady. "Those leopards are resilient. You've given them a fighting chance." Gar's mind was still reeling. He had set the leopards free, sure that they would be safer in the wild. But now, faced with Tavis's unspoken understanding, he was not so sure. The world out there was dangerous, far more so than he had initially realized. Poachers, predators, the unforgiving elements. It was a world of constant threats. "They're out there somewhere," Gar muttered, staring into the fire. "And I can't stop worrying about them." Tavis nodded, folding the map with practiced hands. "I know what it's like. I've tracked these animals for years. It's in their nature to roam, to hunt. They'll survive if they can. But it's up to us to make sure that they have the space and the protection they need." Gar felt a pang of guilt. He had thought he was giving them freedom, but had he done enough? Could he have done more? "I've been thinking about them," Gar said quietly. "Maybe I shouldn't have let them go so soon. Maybe they needed more time." Tavis looked up from the map, his eyes meeting Gar's. "You gave them something most people can't. You gave them their dignity back. That's more than most would do. And you gave them the chance to thrive." Gar nodded slowly, but the uncertainty lingered. There was so much he had yet to understand about the wild, about the leopards, about himself. The silence between the two men stretched on for a few moments before Tavis broke it again, his voice quieter this time. "Do you ever wonder if it's enough?" Tavis asked, his gaze distant. "If we've done enough to make a difference? The world is a harsh place, Gar. We fight to protect what we love, but there's always something else waiting to take it away." Gar's chest tightened. The weight of his past, the loss of his family, the years of solitude, The constant question of whether he was truly doing the right thing pressed heavily on him. It was as if every decision he made carried the weight of the world, and yet the world always seemed to slip through his fingers. He turned away from Tavis, his voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes, I wonder if I've ever really done enough. For anyone." Tavis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, as though he understood the depths of Gaur's struggle. After a long moment, he stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out into the swirling storm. "You've done what you can," Tavis said softly. "And that's all anyone can ever do. The world's a wild place full of dangers and uncertainties, but it's also full of beauty. And sometimes, just sometimes, we get to be part of that beauty." Gaur stood up as well, moving to join Tavis by the window. Together they watched the storm rage outside, the snowflakes dancing in the wind, each one unique, fragile, and fleeting. The wild was a dangerous place, yes, but it was also a place of life, a place where things grew, where creatures roamed free, where the cycles of nature played out with quiet certainty. And despite all the hardships, Gaur realized, there was still beauty to be found in that. "I want to help them," Gaur said, his voice firm now. "I don't want to just let them go out there and be forgotten. I want to make sure they're safe, that they thrive." Tavis turned toward him, a faint smile on his lips. "Then you'll have to be part of something bigger than yourself. You'll have to work with the people who know the land, who know how to protect it, how to fight for it. But most importantly, you'll have to keep that fire alive inside you, the one that says you won't stop fighting for what's right." Gaur felt something stir inside him, a sense of purpose that had been buried for so long. Perhaps he had been too focused on his own past, too absorbed in his own grief to see the bigger picture. But now, in the company of someone like Tavis, who had dedicated his life to the wilderness, Gaur could see a way forward. It wasn't just about the leopards anymore. It was about protecting all the creatures that called these mountains home. It was about ensuring that future generations would have the same chance to witness the beauty of the wild. It was about healing, not just for the animals, but for himself as well. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a new resolve had taken root. "You're right," Gaur said, his voice steady. "I'm not going to let them go. I'll find a way to keep them safe." Tavis nodded, his expression one of quiet approval. "Then you'll find your purpose, Gaur, just like I did, just like we all do." For the first time in a long time, Gaur felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, just a little. He had a mission now, a reason to keep going. And no matter what dangers lay ahead, he would face them, not alone, but with the strength of those who shared his purpose. As the storm continued to howl outside, Gaur knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. And as he turned back toward the fire, he felt a spark of hope flicker within him, a spark that had been dormant for far too long. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be worth it. For the leopards, for the wild, for the future, and for himself. The days after the storm passed slowly, the snow continuing to fall softly across the mountain. The cabin, once a place of solitude and silence, had transformed into something different in Gaur's mind, a place of purpose. Each morning, he stepped out into the snow-covered world with a new sense of responsibility, driven by the determination to see the leopards thrive in the wild. It wasn't enough just to let them go and hope they survived. He now had a role to play in ensuring their safety, a role that felt both daunting and essential. Tavis had left soon after their conversation, telling Gaur that he would return when he was ready. Gaur understood that the path ahead was one he had to walk on his own for a while, but the knowledge that Tavis was out there, ready to help when the time came, gave him a sense of security he hadn't known before. Each day, Gaur made his way to the clearing where he had released the leopards, scanning the area for any sign of them. He'd leave food at the edge of the trees, hoping they would find it. He knew the land well, knew the paths the animals might take, the hiding places they might use to avoid predators or humans. But still, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He spent hours tracking signs of their presence, looking for paw prints in the snow, signs of disturbance in the trees. It was as if the leopards had disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their existence. Gaur couldn't stop thinking about them. The thought of them being hunted, of falling into the wrong hands, haunted him at night. He hadn't realized how deeply he had come to care for these creatures, how much he'd invested in their survival. And so, one morning, after several weeks of searching, Gaur set out with a newfound sense of urgency. The weather had cleared, and he felt the weight of the snow beneath his boots as he trudged deeper into the forest. His goal was to find them, no matter what it took. If they were still alive, he would do everything in his power to ensure they were safe. The cold air nipped at his face, but he hardly noticed. His focus was razor sharp. He knew he had to find them. The sooner the better. He had no idea what dangers they might be facing, but he knew that every passing day without a trace made their chances of survival slimmer. Hours passed as he moved through the forest, the silence of the snow-covered trees only broken by the crunch of his footsteps. There were no signs of the leopards, nothing. Frustration built inside him, the tension growing with each empty moment. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold, and surveyed the area again. He couldn't give up. Not now. And then, in the distance, he spotted it, a mark in the snow. Fresh tracks, leopard tracks. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He followed the trail, carefully stepping over branches and rocks, each step taking him further into the wild, further from the safety of the cabin. He didn't care. He had to find them. The tracks led him to a small ridge where the snow had been disturbed. And there, beneath a tree, he saw them, two figures, sleek and powerful, lying in the shadows. The leopards. His heart stopped for a moment, relief flooding his chest. They were alive. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle them. One of the leopards, the male, lifted its head slightly, eyes gleaming in the dim light. The other, the female, was curled protectively at its side. Both of them were thinner than they should be, their fur matted in places, but they were alive. They had survived. Gar knelt in the snow, his breath clouding in the cold air. "You made it," he whispered, a smile tugging at his lips. "You made it." The male leopard stood slowly, stretching its legs, before it glanced at Gar, as if assessing his presence. Gar held his breath, unsure of how the leopard would react. But instead of running, the leopard stayed, watching him with a quiet intelligence in its eyes. The female leopard stirred as well, but she didn't move far. Both of them seemed to be waiting for something unspoken, something familiar in Gar's presence. For a long moment they simply stood together in the snow, as if acknowledging that they were no longer alone in this wild, frozen world. And then, as if a silent agreement had been made between them, the male leopard turned and began to walk slowly toward the forest, the female following behind. They moved with a grace that belied their injuries, their strength beginning to return. Gar stood up, watching them go. A part of him wanted to call them back, to bring them home, but he knew that was not his place anymore. He had given them the chance to be free, and now they were choosing their path. They would no longer be dependent on him. They would be part of the wild. As they disappeared into the trees, Gar felt a bittersweet pang in his chest. But there was something else too. Pride. He had helped them, and now they were free to live as they should, in the place where they belonged. He stayed there for a long time, watching the trees sway in the wind, listening to the distant sounds of the leopards moving through the forest. For the first time in years, Gar felt a deep sense of peace. He had done the right thing. He had let them go. And as he made his way back to the cabin, he realized that he was no longer just a man living in isolation. He was part of something much bigger. He was part of the wild, part of the cycle of life that sustained it. And in that moment, Gar knew that he had found his purpose, not in solitude, but in connection. The mountains would always be his home, but now he understood that they were also the home of many others, creatures both wild and free. And as long as he lived, he would protect them, fight for them, and cherish the beauty of their existence. He had found hope in the wild, and that hope would never fade. In the weeks that followed, Gar's life took on a quiet rhythm. The leopards had vanished into the wilderness, but their presence lingered in the air, in the silent spaces between the wind's whispers and the rustle of the trees. Every morning he'd step out onto the snow-covered ground, scan the horizon, and listen for any sign of them. Sometimes he thought he heard their distant calls, but when he'd follow the sound, there was nothing but the stillness of the mountain. Yet Gar no longer felt the same weight of isolation. He had let them go, and in doing so he had let go of his own fears. He was no longer a man bound by regret or sorrow. He was part of the wilderness in a way he hadn't been before, not just as an observer, but as a protector, a witness to the lives unfolding around him. One afternoon, as he walked along a ridge overlooking the valley, Gar met a group of hunters. At first he didn't notice them, too wrapped up in the sights and sounds of the land, but their presence, though quiet, was unmistakable. They were out of place in this pristine land, with their heavy packs and the look of men who had come to take more than they needed. "Easy there," one of them called out as Gar approached, raising his hand in a casual greeting. His voice was thick with the accent of the lowlands, not the gentle speech of the mountain folk. Gar paused, his instincts immediately alert. Something about these men didn't sit right with him. He nodded cautiously but kept his distance, looking for The leader of the group, a tall man with a rugged face and a thick beard, stepped forward, his gaze scanning the ridge. "Just passing through," he said, but there was a glint in his eyes that made Gar uneasy. "We heard stories about the mountain. Big cats, you know, snow leopards." Gaur's heart skipped a beat, but his expression remained neutral. "There are no snow leopards here," he said, his voice calm but firm. The hunter studied him for a moment before shrugging. "That's what we've heard, but we'll see for ourselves." Gaur's mind raced. If they were after the leopards, it could mean trouble. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let them fall into the hands of those who would harm them. "Best turn back," Gaur said, his voice low, his eyes narrowed. "This land is sacred, and the wildlife here is protected. Don't risk it." The hunter smirked. "Don't tell me what to do. We know what we're looking for. Stay out of our way." With a nod to his companions, the men continued down the ridge, moving deeper into the forest. Gaur stood there, watching them disappear into the trees. The feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at him like the cold wind that swept through the valley. The stories of the leopards had spread. He could feel it in the way people spoke, the way they looked at him when he passed through the village. They didn't know the whole truth, not yet. But there were rumors about a man who had helped 2 snow leopards survive the harshest of winters. Rumors that had reached the ears of those who might seek to profit from the creature's beauty and rarity. The thought of the leopards falling into the wrong hands drove Gar to action. He couldn't just wait idly by. He had to make sure they were safe, that their freedom remained intact. That night, he sat by the fire, his thoughts turning over the options before him. He couldn't do this alone, not anymore. He needed help, and so he made a decision. The next morning, he set out to find Tavis. It wasn't an easy journey, especially with the snow piling up again. But Gaur was determined. He needed Tavis's expertise, the help of someone who knew the land and its hidden paths, someone who could help him track down the poachers and protect the leopards once and for all. After 2 days of travel, Gaur finally reached the old cabin where Tavis had settled. The fire in the hearth was a welcome sight, and Tavis, sitting in a worn leather chair, looked up with a raised eyebrow as Gaur entered. "I wondered when you'd come," Tavis said with a half smile, setting aside the book he'd been reading. "Something on your mind?" Gaur didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The leopards are in danger," he said, his voice serious. "I need your help. There are hunters on the mountain, looking for them." Tavis's expression turned grim. "I figured it wouldn't be long before they found out. The way people talk in the village, the rumors. It was only a matter of time before someone decided they could profit from those sea cats. We need to get them before the hunters do," Gaur said. "We need to make sure the leopards are safe, permanently." Tavis nodded, standing up and grabbing his coat. "I'm with you. Let's make sure they don't end up in the wrong hands." Together, the 2 men set out that night, moving swiftly and silently through the snow-covered mountains. They tracked the hunters, following their trail through the woods. Gaur's heart pounded with urgency. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, they could hear the hunters ahead, laughing and joking. Gaur motioned for Tavis to stay back, and they moved into position, hidden in the trees. Gaur's breath was steady, his focus absolute. "Remember," Tavis whispered, "we don't want to hurt them. Just stop them from getting any closer." Gaur nodded. The leopard's safety came first. There would be no violence unless it was absolutely necessary. As the hunters drew closer, Gaur and Tavis made their move. They circled around, cutting off their path and creating a barrier. The hunters froze, surprised by the sudden appearance of the 2 men in the snow. "Turn back," Gaur said in a commanding voice. "You're not going to find what you're looking for here." The leader of the hunters scowled, stepping forward. "What's this? You think you can stop?" Gaur stood tall, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you, leave now. If you don't, you'll regret it." The tension was thick in the air, but the hunters seemed to realize they were outmatched. With muttered curses, they backed away, disappearing into the dark forest. As they watched the hunters leave, Gaur felt a wave of relief wash over him. The leopards were safe, for now, but he knew that this was just the beginning. There would always be more threats, more dangers to face. But for the first time in a long while, Gaur felt a sense of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had allies, and together they would protect what was precious. And the leopards, wild and free, would continue to roam the mountains, their spirits untamed. The bond between Gaur and the leopards had always been one of respect, a silent understanding forged in the harshest of winters. Even now, after all this time, their connection remained, deep and unbroken. They had been given the chance to return to the wild, to live their lives on their own terms. And while Gaur knew that his role in their journey had ended, a part of him would always carry them in his heart. He often found himself gazing out over the vast landscape, his thoughts drifting to the leopards as they continued to roam free in the wilderness. The mountain had become their home once more, and Gaur, though far from their physical presence, could still feel their spirits in the wind, in the quiet whisper of the trees. The man who had once lived in isolation, weighed down by the pain of his past, was no longer the same. The mountain had healed him, and the leopards had given him a new purpose. He had learned that love wasn't confined to the boundaries of species, and that even in the most unlikely of places, bonds could form that transcended words. And as the snow continued to fall gently on the mountains, Gaur stood tall, knowing that he had given all he could. The leopards were safe, free, and in the wild once more. Their love, their bond, would never fade. It would echo through the mountains, forever a part of the landscape, forever a part of him. Months passed, and Gaur's life began to settle back into the rhythm of the mountains. The storms came and went, as they always did, and the world around him remained as silent and eternal as ever. He spent his days checking traps, mending fences, and tending to the cabin, but his mind always wandered back to the leopards. He had heard nothing of them since the hunters had been sent away. There had been no sign of poachers in the area, and no one had come to the village with stories of spotting the elusive creatures. Perhaps they had made it to the wilds, away from human eyes, just as Gaur had hoped. But every now and then, when the wind howled through the trees or the mountains seemed to speak in a language only he could understand, Gaur would feel a strange presence. It was like a whisper on the breeze, a fleeting sense of something or someone watching. And sometimes in the quietest moments of the night, he would swear he heard the faintest sound, a low growl carried by the wind, echoing in the mountains. He had grown accustomed to the stillness, to the solitude, but the memory of the leopards, of their wild beauty and untamed spirits, stayed with him. The mountain had changed him in ways he couldn't quite describe. It had given him a new purpose, a new understanding of the balance between man and nature. He wasn't just a spectator in the wilderness anymore. He was a part of it. Then one afternoon, as Gaur was walking along the ridge overlooking the valley, he saw something that made his heart race. In the distance, near the edge of the forest, a figure moved silently through the trees. It was large and graceful, moving with a fluidity that made it seem like part of the landscape itself. Gaur's breath caught in his throat as he watched, his mind racing. He recognized the sleek, spotted coat, the distinctive shape of the creature. It was one of the leopards. But there was something different about it. It was no longer the fragile, injured animal he had cared for. This leopard was strong, its coat glistening in the sunlight, its movements confident and purposeful. For a moment, Gaur stood frozen, watching the creature as it disappeared into the trees. He didn't know if it had seen him, if it even recognized him after all this time. But in that brief moment, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The leopards had found their place in the world, just as he had. With a deep breath, Gaur turned and began to make his way back to the cabin. The mountain had given him a gift, a sign that he had done the right thing, that he had set the leopards free to live their lives as they were meant to. As he walked, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of snow and pine. It was as though the mountain itself was speaking to him, telling him that everything had come full circle. The leopards were out there, thriving, living in the wild once more, and he too had found his place among the peaks, no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past. Gaur returned to his cabin that evening with a sense of quiet fulfillment. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. He sat down by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, his thoughts drifting to the leopards, to the mountains, to the life he had come to love. In the distance, a sound drifted to him, barely audible over the wind. It was a low growl, distant but unmistakable. Gaur smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet joy. He knew that the leopards were out there, still roaming the mountains, still free. And that was enough. As the seasons changed, Gaur found himself at peace with the world, in a way he hadn't been before. The leopards were out there, living their lives in the wild, and he was content knowing that they were thriving, free from the dangers of poachers and captivity. His time with them had been brief, but it had changed him, reshaped him into someone more connected to the land, to the creatures that called it home. One crisp autumn morning, as Gaur was gathering firewood near the edge of the forest, he heard a sound that stopped him in his tracks. It was faint at first, just a rustling in the leaves, but then he heard it again, closer this time. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the noise. From the trees emerged a figure, sleek and graceful, with fur that gleamed like moonlight. Gaur's breath caught in his throat as the snow leopard stepped into the clearing. It was the same one he had seen before, its coat rich and full, its movements fluid and silent. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, just watching each other. The leopard's eyes, so full of intelligence and understanding, met Gaur's. In that moment, Gaur knew that the bond they shared was not something that could be broken. It wasn't about ownership or control. It was about respect, about understanding that they were both part of something much larger than themselves. The leopard took a few steps toward him, its tail flicking behind it as it moved with a grace that seemed to defy nature. Gaur held his breath, watching as the creature circled him, pausing for a moment to study him before turning and slipping back into the forest, its silhouette fading into the shadows of the trees. Gaur stood there for a long time, the sound of the leopard's footsteps echoing in his mind. He hadn't spoken a word, but the exchange had meant everything. He knew that the leopards would always carry a piece of him, just as he would carry a piece of them. Their time together, brief as it had been enough. As the days turned to months, Gaur's life continued, but something had shifted. He no longer felt the heavy burden of his past. The isolation, once a prison, had become a sanctuary, a place where he had rediscovered his purpose. The mountains had healed him, and in return, he had given them the care and respect they deserved. One evening, as the sun set behind the peaks, Gaur stood at the edge of the ridge, looking out at the vast wilderness before him. He could feel the presence of the leopards, the echoes of their journey, deep in his soul. The mountains were alive with the sound of wind and wildlife, and in that moment, Gaur knew that he'd found his place in the world. His bond with the snow leopards, his connection to the land, would last forever, echoing through the mountains long after he was gone. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Gaur smiled, knowing that the gift of the mountains was a gift that would never fade.